Welcome to the place where we wrap the arms of Jesus around you where you are, so that where you are becomes holy ground. The place, transforming your place into the place. Good afternoon, man. Good afternoon. It's such a beautiful day that the Lord has made. This is the day that the Lord has made. We shall rejoice and be glad in it. We're so excited to be with you today for another edition of our lunch break cyber Bible study, hosted by The Place. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the place. The place's purpose is to wrap the arms of Jesus around you where you are, so that where you are becomes holy ground. We seek to transform any place, even your place, into the place. And we expect this place to be a place of healing, a place of wholeness, a place of prosperity, a place of growth, a place of peace. We're so excited for you to be with us. We started this series last week dealing with the mind of God. And before we get into today, this is November 1st, right? It's the first day of the last 2 months of the year. So I want to know real fast, it's lunch break time. So, what are you eating? If you're eating something, drop it in the comments. Make sure you like, tag, and share. Um, Let us know what you're eating and where you're watching us from, right? What are you eating for lunch? Just put it in the comments. Just put it in the comments. So, we're going to continue this study on the mind of God, but we're really going to look at it through the amazing lens of God's creation narrative, or God's creation of the Bible. I think that is so important for us as we think about the mind of God, how intentional God was about what we read and how that is important for how we shape our understanding of God. The purpose of the Bible, I believe, is an introduction of God. The Bible introduces God, right? And God's plan and God's will. It's an introduction, which literally means that it is not a permanent place. It is not the end all be all. God is bigger than the Bible. The Bible just introduces us to God. The Bible is God's bio, God's resume, right? But it is just an introduction. It's just an introduction. So I say all that to say today we're going to look at this idea of lessons from the beginning. Lessons from the beginning. So give me a second. We're gonna get started, right? So we're gonna look at lessons from the beginning. So let's get started. This is a study of the book of Genesis, a study of the book of beginnings. The first thing we need to understand is the original name of Genesis, right? And in order to understand the original name, we have to understand the original language of Genesis. We have to understand that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, right? It was in Hebrew. And translating it from Hebrew, it was first translated into Latin and then into Greek. So the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translation of the Bible into Greek, is actually a translation of Hebrew into Latin, then into Greek. Now, why is that important? That's important because that allows us to understand that there are words in Hebrew that didn't translate into Latin, that therefore are mistranslated or omitted in the Greek translation, which was then translated into English. So In order for you to really understand the Bible and its original intention, you must go back to the you must go back to the original language, right? That's the first part, right? So let's look at this again. When you look at it in Hebrew, Genesis, as all of the books of the Torah or the Pentateuch, those first five books, they're not named Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Um, Genesis's name is Bereshit, and it literally means in the beginning. And all of these books were written, their titles come from the first couple of words of that book. So the generations of heaven and earth, right? Bereshit. Then you have Shemot, the names of, because the book of Exodus begins with the names of. Vakira, because the book of Numbers begins, no, I mean Leviticus begins with this word, begins with this statement that includes the word called. Let me tell you for sure so you can understand. Leviticus begins like this. Leviticus begins chapter 1, verse 1 begins, now the Lord called, Vakira, right? Called. Um, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers begins, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. So Bidmabar in the wilderness is how it was originally named, and Devarim, the words, which is the beginning of Deuteronomy, right? So these original words, titles of these first five books, right? So who wrote it, right? Who is credited with writing Genesis? So we credit Moses with writing these first five books with some insertion, right? And this is Bible study, so we're not going to get too deep, but I do believe Bible study should be deeper than Sunday school. So I believe that there should be a deeper level of thinking when it comes to um, Bible study, right? So we're going to get a little deeper, right? So Moses is credited, right? Moses is credited. Yes. Yes, this will be available on replay. Moses is credited. Um, and Tawania, go ahead and keep eating this scroll, right? Moses is credited. And what qualified Moses, right? So Moses had three stages of development that we know of. First of all, Moses spent his first 40 years in Egypt, right? Then he spent his next 40 years in Midian, right? And then his final 40 years leading the Israelites in the wilderness. And in this time, Moses decided to write down the stories that Moses heard. Moses had been told about this, but Moses decided that this would be a great time somewhere during this wilderness period to write down these stories to be remembered, to be remembered, right? So the next thing we think about was, when was this written? When was Genesis written? Right? And you got to think about this as we backdrop this off of the mind of God. God allowed it to be written when it was written because of God's awesome understanding of the importance of history. Whew, I could stop right there, right? The importance of history, right? It's important for us to keep track of our history. It's important for our history to be written down, because if not recorded, it simply becomes um, just stories that could be altered, which some of this is, right? Understand that some of this biblical narrative has been altered, has been embellished, um, has been stretched, right? From the original occurrence to when it was actually captured in writing, and even after that, but we'll get to that in just a second. All right. So the next thing is, when was it written? Right. So
First thing you got to think about is this idea of the history in the text. So the history in the text is what's going on inside of the story. So in the text, this Genesis covers around 2,370 years of history. About 24 generations are covered during from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 50. It chronicles from Eden all the way to Egypt, right? That's Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 50, right? So the history of the text is given um in Exodus, in Numbers, right? So why is this, why was it written? Right? Why was it actually written down? Well, you understand, like we talked about Moses having these children that they've escorted out of Israel, out of Egypt, right? In the Exodus. And so for 430 years, from the end of Genesis to Exodus, we find that these children lost their historical understanding of God after years of captivity. And because of the Egyptian influence, as they began to wander, they had no reverence for God. They didn't know how powerful God was. And so as a result, they made several mistakes in the wilderness that led them to end up the majority of the elders dying, right? Remember Numbers 13 and 14, they went to spy the land. They gave the bad report, 10 of them. As a result, God's anger burned, and God said that because you thought you couldn't occupy the land, I'm going to let those who are 20 years and older die in this 40 years of wandering. And then I'm going to raise up your children to occupy the promised land. Then in Numbers 20, if you remember, God, um, Moses, instead of talking to the rock, struck the rock and also was condemned to die in the wilderness and not see the promised land. So, with all the elders dying, right, Moses understood that there would be nobody to tell the story. So, Moses began to write it down. So, here are some myths you need to understand. First of all, Genesis is not written real time. So, everything that is said in chapters 1 all the way through chapter 50, the writer was not around to actually record it real time. So it's based through or passed on through oral tradition. In other words, it is extremely important to understand that everything that is written down is hearsay. Yeah, we say it's inspired by God. That's true. Inspired in the sense that there was an urging to write it, but the stories were only recorded as they were retold over and over again, generation through generation, and eventually told by Jochebed to Moses. Jochebed, right? Wife of Amram, right? Moses' mother, who ended up telling him the stories probably while nursing. Right? So Moses acquired all these stories through his birth and through his rearing, right? And it's a historical account of Israel. Understand, other nations are there, but there is no real historical account except for oftentimes through genealogical naming that you figure out where these people come from, but you don't know their history. And every people has their own creation narrative. There's a creation narrative from the Babylons, from the Egyptians, from the Sumerians, from, right, all of these people groups, right? These ethnic groups, they all have their own, right? But this historical account, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, is the historical narrative for Israel, the Jews. All right. Just want to get that said. So, who is it written to? Well, in the study of exegesis, right? Um, in the study of exegesis, Jesus, what we need to understand is that It's the critical explanation or interpretation, the pulling out of what is in the text. And there are three ways to interpret, which is how you figure out your audience, right? There are three ways. The first way is synchronically. Synchronically is with time. That's the immediate text. Diachronic is historically. That's when you do the background, figure out the people, all the background about it, and then existentially, which is the current application. So when we think about who's it written to synchronically, the immediate audience, who was present in the text, that's who it's written to, who was present there, right? So you look at that Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness. Who's the synchronic audience? The synchronic audience is whoever God is talking to and the atmosphere that would eventually produce. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, and God said, let there be light. The immediate audience is the atmosphere. That's who God's talking to. Now, diachronically, right? The original reader who read the text first. Now, understand that the reader of the text is not the same as the audience, the immediate audience of the text. Ha! So understand that this writing down probably didn't get read. These first 5 books probably didn't get read till the time of the prophets. By the time it was actually scribed and recorded and reproduced, these original writings probably originally appeared maybe in the time of the judges. So Samuel, right? At the creation of the temple, the original temple, not even the tabernacle, the temple, they probably had these writings by that time. The prophets read, right? But they were continually scribed. So just thinking the original reader was not. This is amazing to think about, right? So uh Joshua probably had access, but if you think about before that, right? Amazingly enough, Joseph knew history based on what was passed orally, but never read the scriptures. There was nothing to read because it hadn't been written yet. I just think we need to think about that. The original reader, right? So the original reader, the audience, and then the purpose of what it was written for the reader, right? So understand that Levitical law was written down by Moses, but it wasn't applied until Joshua and the judges. I mean, it was known orally, but it wasn't recorded to be applied until they actually crossed over. I just think some of this stuff is just amazing to think about, right? As we think about and process this. And then you got the existential reader, which is us. So we're the existential audience, right? We're the current reader of it. So we're a reader and we're now applying knowledge based on scripture that wasn't written about us, nor was it originally written to us. We're a third party reader still trying to apply it. It's good stuff, right? So why was it written? All right. So it was written so that the reader could learn history and practices, right? To chronicle this origin of creation, but synchronically for the immediate audience, it didn't even apply. So it was written to tell the immediate audience's story. That's why it was written. For the original reader, it was written to remind them of their history so that they wouldn't make the same mistakes again of the original audience. Right? So there should be no doubt to God's power by the original reader because that was the mistake made by the original audience. Right? They shouldn't doubt. And then for us, the current reader, we get a great understanding of what God has done, which builds our faith in what God can do. Again, God is bigger than the Bible, It's an introduction to God. It's God 101, but God has some advanced courses that many of us have testified we've experienced. Some of the advanced stuff that wasn't even done in the Bible, but God is doing. Wasn't even thought about in the Bible, but God is doing. Right? So the Bible provides a basis, a standard, a starting point for understanding and for exploring the possibilities of God in our present. Right? We're almost done because again, try only be on 30 minutes. But this is good stuff. So where was it written? Right? Here's several possible times. Possibly God wrote it, Moses wrote it, yeah, when he received the first scrolls, that's possible. When he received the second scroll, I mean the second commandments, the second tablets, that's possible. But some of the stuff hadn't occurred, like Leviticus and Numbers hadn't occurred. So more than likely, it was written after Moses was condemned to die in the wilderness. So somewhere after Numbers 20. Now I wrote Numbers 33, 1 through 3. Let me read it for you. Numbers 33, 1 through 3 said, "These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now Moses wrote down the starting point of their journey at the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting point." Right? So God now gave unction to Moses to write this, right? To chronicle this 40 years of wandering that would now lead to this precipice of Moses getting to see promised land, to ascribe and assign Joshua to succeed him, and to then give place for this transition. Now you got to understand, right? Crazy enough, Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses and the hiding of Moses' bones, but Moses couldn't write that if Moses had already passed. And a lot of the flowery language about Moses is written to no greater prophet, right? All these things that are written probably couldn't be written by Moses or were added to kind of solidify Moses's position as great prophet and leader, but probably were written posthumously. Can't even say the word, but after his death by someone else, right? Here's the next thing. How was it written? So the original writings again were oral tradition. Then they were written down on scrolls and transferred over and over again by scribes. Now, scribes, you learn in the New Testament, they call lawyers because they're so familiar with the text. But scribes were so astute in their writing, they duplicated the scrolls almost as carbon copies. But if you've ever seen Hebrew writing, you know that there are dots and lines that could easily be considered stray marks if ink doesn't dry or whatever they're using, which could lead to mistranslations of the words, right? Also, there are several words that look similar that have different meanings or that have several different meanings and also when translated. So the scribes were important because they knew the exact word count on a page, they knew the exact number of symbols, they knew the exact number because originally there were no verses or chapters, there were no subheadings. It was just storyline on long pieces of scroll, right? So there are a lot of rooms for error. And there's a lot of erroneous information as translated from one language to the other. But here's the most important part because I don't want to dwell on that. I don't want to dwell on that because we got to get out of here. What was written, right? This is the most important thing. These amazing themes of Genesis, right? These amazing themes of Genesis. Let's look at them, right? The creation story, right? The power and compassion of God, a uniform bloodline, the power of unity, spread of nations, the patriarchs, the patriarchal covenants, the generational mistakes, the repeated forgiveness of God, the surviving of scandals, tribal creation, and providential placement. These are amazing themes of Genesis, all in the book of Genesis, right? All of these themes are just in the book of Genesis alone. And God needed us to understand this as a baseline for our understanding. Creation, Genesis chapter 1. The power and compassion of God that took place in chapters 2, 3, and 4, right? This uniform bloodline all coming from Seth, right? And then recapitulating in out of Noah's bloodline. This power of unity, this Tower of Babel, and how powerful God said we would be if we all work together. Then the dispersing, the spread of the nations, right? Then the patriarchs, beginning with Abram, and this repeated covenantal theme that really started with Noah and then was repicked up with Abram. This repeated forgiveness, how God continued to forgive after mistakes. These scandals, starting with Isaac and Jacob and Esau and continuing through this narrative. This wrestling with God of Jacob that changed his name to Israel and this tribal creation. And then this providential placement from Eden to Egypt of Joseph, which then sets the backdrop for this story of Exodus. But it's an amazing narrative that must be recorded, right? So I'm done. I'm done. I thank you for viewing. Let's just remember that all of these lessons come from the beginning and they show just amazingly how awesome God is. Now there's some things we don't think about, right? And we'll probably get to that as we go into Exodus possibly, or this continuing of this mind of Christ or mind of God, this thinking of God that we're going to talk about next week. But I just want you to remember just how awesome God is in God's totality of thinking and planning. So that was an amazing time. Listen, I thank y'all. If y'all want to connect to the place, if y'all want to connect to the place, to the place, we do this Bible study every Wednesday at noon for about 30 minutes. Um, connect to the place. If you want to connect to the place, please type the place to 84576 84576. That connects you to us. You can get like the notes, you can get the replays. Um, here's the next thing. Um, if you want to sow, if this lesson has added value and you want to sow into the place, right? You can Cash App, PayPal, Givelify, Zelle, right? All of these options are possible. All of these options are possible. All the Place Inc. We have a lot more stuff coming. Again, we do our Place podcast on Thursdays, Rush Hour on Tuesdays, midweek Bible study on Wednesdays. We got some in-person pop-ups. Um, Tawani, it's funny you mentioned that. I'll be reaching out to you this week to talk about some things with you and Fred. This is an amazing season, and I'm so excited about what God is about to do. Right? So take a moment if you want to give. Listen, don't miss the opportunity to sow into good ground, right? So we're getting ready to get out of here, and I'm so excited about this opportunity. But I want to remind you who we are. We are the place, right? And the purpose of the place is to wrap the arms of Jesus around you where you are, so that where you are becomes holy ground. We seek to transform any place, even your place, right where you're watching us from, is holy ground because God is there, right? And we're trying to remove this barrier that was actually removed at the death of Christ, where we put this barrier between God and you. Right? God's never been far away from you. God has always been where you are. And once you realize that, you operate with a sense of authority because everything that you've been worried about has been canceled by the presence of God. There is nothing to fear when God is with you. And because God is with you in your place, you should have nothing to fear. Listen, we're back next week. I love you. Have an amazing day. To God be the glory. Goodbye.
Welcome to the place where we wrap the arms of Jesus around you where you are, so that where you are becomes holy ground. The place, transforming your place into the place.